Children's eyes in Dachau. The first thing I remember about that day was the silence. Not the kind of silence you get in the countryside at dawn, nor the quiet of a church before the sermon starts. This was something else entirely, a thick, suffocating void, as if even the air had given up on carrying sound. We had heard stories, rumors whispered through the ranks, of what we might find inside Dachau. But stories don't prepare you for the weight in your chest when you step through the gates of hell. I was just a corporal, Frank Pearson, 24 years old, born in Kansas, raised with Sunday school sermons about good and evil. But nothing in the Bible described what we saw that day. The camp stretched before us like a vision from a nightmare. Rows of barracks, skeletal figures in striped rags, smoke still rising from chimneys that should have never existed. Some of the men swore under their breath, others just stood there, gripping their rifles as if holding on to something real in a place that defied reality. The stench was unbearable. Death had settled into the very soil of this place. It clung to our uniforms, our skin, our souls. But it wasn't the dead that haunted me the most. It was the living. They emerged slowly, cautiously, like ghosts unsure if they were still part of this world. Some collapsed before they even reached us, their bodies too weak to carry them one step further. And then, among them, I saw her. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her dress nothing more than torn fabric hanging off her frail frame. Her hair, once blonde, was matted with dirt, and her skin clung tightly to her bones. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold. They weren't the eyes of a child. They held something ancient, something that had seen more than any human should. And in her tiny hand, she clutched the fingers of an even smaller boy, no older than 4. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't speak. She just looked up at me, those hollow eyes searching for something. Recognition, salvation, maybe just proof that the world outside of this place still existed. I reached into my pack, fumbling for anything I could offer. Chocolate, crackers, anything. My fingers found a piece of candy, and I held it out to her, but she didn't move. Instead, she turned her head slightly, as if listening to something just behind her. I followed her gaze, but there was nothing there. Then, in the distance, a scream cut through the silence. It wasn't human. It was something primal, something torn from the depths of despair. And just like that, the spell broke. The camp came alive with sound, cries, sobs, the shouts of my fellow soldiers as they tried to help the ones who could still be saved. I looked back at the girl, but she was already walking away, leading the boy toward one of the barracks. My boots felt rooted to the ground, my breath shallow. Something about her felt wrong. Not in the way the others did, not just the weight of suffering, but something deeper. As if she knew something we didn't. I took a step forward, but then a hand clamped down on my shoulder. "Come on, Pearson," Sergeant Mills growled. "We got work to do." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, and turned away from the girl. But even as I moved, I could feel her eyes still on me, watching, waiting. I spent the next few hours moving through the camp, trying to do what little I could. But how do you help people who have already lost everything? The medics worked fast, handing out water, blankets, whatever rations we had. Some prisoners collapsed the moment they were touched, as if their bodies had finally given up now that they were free. Others refused to move at all, their minds trapped in a reality we couldn't reach. I caught sight of the girl again as we moved deeper into the camp. She was standing near one of the wooden barracks, her brother still clutching her hand. She didn't wave, didn't call out, just stood there, watching me. Something about her unsettled me. Not just the way she carried herself, so still, so quiet, but the way the other prisoners moved around her, avoiding her without even realizing it, their eyes darting away as if afraid to see her too clearly. "Pearson!" Someone shouted my name, pulling my attention away. I turned to see Private O'Leary waving me over. He stood beside a row of open train cars, the ones the Germans had used to bring prisoners here. But these weren't just empty freight cars. They were full of bodies. I had thought I'd already seen the worst of it, but I was wrong. The smell alone was enough to make my stomach lurch. Bodies stacked on top of each other, twisted, contorted in ways that no living person should ever be. Some of the men turned away, unable to look. O'Leary just stood there, shaking his head. "They didn't even get them inside," he muttered. "They just left them here." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to look, to remember. The world needed to see this. But then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed something, movement. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But there, among the bodies, something shifted. A small hand. Without thinking, I climbed into the car, pushing past the corpses. The hand twitched again, barely moving, but it was enough. I reached down and found a boy, no older than 10, buried beneath the dead. His eyes were half open, glassy, his lips cracked from dehydration. I pulled him into my arms, his body light as a rag doll. He barely reacted, just a slow, shallow breath against my sleeve. "Medic!" I yelled, jumping down from the train car. One of the medics rushed over, but even as I handed the boy off, I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned back toward the barracks, searching for the girl and her brother. They were gone. I scanned the camp, my pulse quickening. Something about them didn't sit right. They had been too clean, too untouched compared to the others. But that wasn't possible. No one walked out of this place unscathed. A hand gripped my arm. I turned, expecting to see Mills or O'Leary. It was one of the prisoners, an older man, his eyes sunken, his body barely more than bones. "She is still here," he whispered in German. I frowned, trying to make sense of his words. "Who?" His grip tightened, his fingers like iron. The girl. She never left. A cold weight settled in my stomach. I wanted to ask more, but before I could, he let go and shuffled away, disappearing into the sea of survivors. I stood there frozen as the screams of the camp still echoed around me. And for the first time that day, I felt something colder than death itself. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The camp didn't settle even after the sun went down. The living wandered in a daze, too weak to move but too restless to lie still. Some sobbed, some prayed, some simply stared at nothing. Every now and then, a medic would call for help when another survivor slipped away, their bodies unable to hold on any longer. I kept thinking about the girl and her brother. I searched for them again before nightfall, moving between the barracks, asking anyone who was strong enough to speak if they had seen them. Some just shook their heads. Others looked away, muttering under their breath. A few crossed themselves, as if warding off something they refused to name. By midnight, I was exhausted, but my nerves wouldn't let me rest. I found myself walking toward the far end of the camp, where the crematorium stood. The place was quiet now, the ovens long cold, but the air still carried the memory of what had happened there. And that's when I saw her. She stood just beyond a doorway, her small frame barely visible in the darkness. The boy was beside her, gripping her dress, his tiny fingers curled into the fabric. I opened my mouth to call out, but no sound came. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes locking onto mine. And then she did something I wasn't prepared for. She smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile a child should have. It was knowing, almost sad, like she had been waiting for me to find her. My legs felt heavy, but I forced myself forward, stepping closer. My mouth was dry, my heartbeat too loud in my ears. "Are you?" My voice cracked. I swallowed hard and tried again. "Are you all right?" She tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. And then, in the softest whisper, she spoke. "We've been waiting for you." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I took another step, but then a gust of wind swept through the crematorium, slamming the heavy metal door shut with a deafening clang. I jumped, my hand instinctively reaching for my sidearm. The noise echoed in the stillness, and for a moment, I could hear nothing else. When I turned back, they were gone. I stood there, my breath shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears. The night stretched around me, thick and suffocating. And then, from somewhere in the dark, the sound of a child's laughter drifted through the air. Light, faint, almost distant. I didn't move for a long time, because deep down I knew. Somewhere in the endless void of this place, in the ashes, in the bones, in the silence, they were still here. I stumbled away from the crematorium, my mind in a haze, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The laughter still echoed faintly in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something I wasn't ready to face. I went back to the barracks where my platoon had set up a temporary camp, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the sounds of the night, the shuffling of feet, the low murmur of voices, the occasional sob, but nothing like what had happened earlier. The next morning, we were supposed to begin processing the survivors, separating the sick and the wounded, trying to provide what help we could. But my mind kept drifting back to the girl, to her eyes, to the way she had spoken as if she knew things no child should. I asked around again. Nobody had seen her, not since the night before. Some said she must have been a hallucination, a figment of the horrors we were all enduring. Others insisted that there were still children hidden in the camp, somehow surviving the worst that had been done to them. But there was one man, an old prisoner who had been there for what seemed like an eternity. His name was Victor, and I found him sitting near a fire, his eyes tired and distant. When I approached, he didn't speak right away. He just stared into the flames, as if they held the answers to questions nobody dared ask. "I know what you're looking for," he said finally, his voice low. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "What do you mean?" Victor looked up at me, his face a map of pain and survival. "The girl. And the ball." I froze. How did he know? "Don't ask me how," he continued, his gaze heavy with secrets. "But I've seen them too. Not just once. Many times. And I know why they're here." I took a seat beside him, my heart beating faster now. "What do you mean, why they're here?" Victor's eyes flicked toward the far side of the camp, where a group of prisoners were being led away by the soldiers. They are part of this place in ways that even the guards don't understand. This camp, this evil, it has a way of calling to the souls of the lost. Some of them, they don't leave. They linger. They become part of it. And those children, they are the embodiment of it all. I shook my head, not understanding. "What are you saying?" "They're not real." "They are real," Victor replied, his voice growing quieter, as if afraid the wind would carry his words away. "But they are not like us. They have seen the horrors of this place, and they have become part of it. They are the lost souls of Dachau, trapped between the living and the dead." I stared at him, disbelief spreading through my chest. "But they're children." Victor looked at me, his eyes hollow. "And yet they are not. Not anymore. Their souls are twisted by the darkness here. They are the last remnants of all that has been destroyed." The air around us grew colder, as if the weight of his words was sinking into the very ground beneath us. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see those small figures watching me again. But there was nothing. Just the endless rows of barracks, the sounds of the camp, the echo of history's cruelty. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Victor looked back at me, his face softening for a moment. "We remember. That's all we can do. Because one day, the stories of this place will fade, and the souls that haunt it will slip away into the darkness. But as long as we remember, they will not be forgotten." I nodded slowly, the weight of his words pressing down on me. He was right. Dachau wasn't just a camp. It was a graveyard, a place where the past would never truly die. And those children, those lost souls, were a part of that. But even as Victor spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't seen the last of the girl and her brother. They were out there somewhere, watching, waiting. Maybe they were the last vestiges of something we couldn't fully understand. Or maybe they were something else entirely. I didn't know. And maybe I would never know. But as I stood up to leave, I couldn't help but glance once more toward the distance. And in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the barracks, I thought I saw something. A flash of movement. A small figure, too still, too quiet. And for the briefest moment, I could have sworn the girl was smiling again. The days blurred together in that place. It was as though time itself had grown too weary to move forward. We worked in shifts, trying to salvage what we could from the remnants of humanity that remained within Dachau's walls. We carried the dead out of the barracks, we gave food and water to the living. We did what we could, but in the end, it all felt so small. It all felt so meaningless. Yet every time the sun dipped below the horizon, the silence would return, and with it, the feeling that something was wrong. That something was still watching, waiting, as if it hadn't yet fully revealed itself. I find myself turning, half expecting to see that small, ghostly figure standing in the distance. The girl. But every time, there was nothing. Just the endless rows of barracks, the dull hum of the wind, and the far-off screams of those who had yet to come to terms with the reality of their new existence. It was on the fourth day, just after the noon roll call, that I saw her again. This time, I wasn't near the barracks or the crematorium. No, this time she appeared in the most unexpected of places, the courtyard, where soldiers and prisoners alike gathered, a momentary respite from the chaos. I was leaning against a wall, my eyes scanning the crowd, when something made me look up. It was the same girl, standing at the far end of the courtyard, her back to the wall. She didn't look at me immediately. Instead, she seemed to be scanning the soldiers, her small face impassive, as if she were searching for something, or perhaps someone. My heart raced, my feet frozen to the ground. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. She was so small, so fragile, her hands still wrapped tightly around the boy's. But there was something different about her now. A heaviness had settled in her expression, something darker. I moved slowly toward her, instinctively drawn by the pull of her presence. The camp around me seemed to fade, and for a moment, it felt like the air itself had shifted. A strange sense of dread mixed with curiosity tugged at me, but I kept moving forward. As I got closer, she finally turned her head toward me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and in them I saw a flicker, something almost like recognition. But this time, there was no smile. Instead, a sadness lingered in the depths of her gaze, one that made my chest tighten. It was as if she knew something I didn't. I stopped in my tracks, unsure whether to approach or turn away. But before I could make a decision, she spoke. "Why did you come here?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but cut through the stillness of the courtyard like a blade. I froze. It wasn't the question I was expecting. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I found myself struggling to respond. I'm not sure," I stammered, suddenly feeling foolish for not having an answer. "We came to help." "To stop it." She tilted her head, considering my words. The boy beside her shifted, his wide eyes watching me with an unsettling intensity. "You can't stop it," she said softly, her voice almost a sigh. "You can't undo what's been done." Her words sent a chill through me, deeper than anything I'd felt since I first entered the camp. I tried to speak, to argue, but the words wouldn't come. "Do you understand?" she asked, her gaze never wavering. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I did. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat felt tight, my mind fogged by the weight of her words. The boy tugged at her sleeve, and she bent down to him, her hand resting gently on his head. It was such a simple, tender gesture, and yet it felt out of place in a world so broken, so tainted by death. "Maybe you're right," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I still have to try." She straightened, her eyes locking onto mine once more, and for a moment I saw something in her face, something almost like pity. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "You can't undo the past. Not here. Not in Dachau." And then, just as quickly as she appeared, she turned, her small form blending into the shadows, disappearing as if she had never been there at all. I stood there, my heart racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The courtyard around me seemed so much quieter now, as though the very air had become still with the weight of her words. I didn't know what she meant. Not fully. But something told me that I wasn't just looking at a child. I wasn't looking at a survivor, a victim. No, I was looking at something else entirely, a presence born from this place, from the darkness that hung over it. And I wondered, for the briefest moment, if the camp itself had shaped her, if it had taken her, twisted her into something that existed between the living and the dead. A child trapped in a nightmare of history's making. I didn't know, but I had to find out. The days that followed were a blur. We continued our work, sorting, cleaning, trying to rebuild some semblance of order. But in the back of my mind, the question gnawed at me, who was she? And why had she appeared to me, of all people? I kept searching, asking around, but no one had seen her again. No one knew anything about a little girl and her brother. They didn't exist. At least, not in the way I understood. But I couldn't let it go. Not anymore. I had to find her. I had to understand what she meant when she said, "You can't undo what's been done." I didn't know if I'd ever find the answers. But one thing was clear. Dachau had left its mark on me. And maybe, just maybe, the girl was a part of that mark. A part of the history that refused to be erased. And somehow, I knew I couldn't walk away until I understood what that meant.